My daughter could marry a prince, yet she chose this pauper. In a banquet hall of 280 guests, the powerful CEO clamped his daughter's wrist and dragged her away amid sneering eyes. Everyone assumed the boyfriend would stay silent, swallowing humiliation without resistance. But at that exact moment, a seemingly gentle hand intervened, locking the arrogant man's wrist until he buckled to his knees. The entire hall fell silent. The man they scorned was a former Navy SEAL strong enough to flip the entire banquet on its head. Sophia Carter stood at the edge of the glittering ballroom, her plain gray dress catching the light in a way that made it look almost silver. Her face bare of makeup glowed soft under the chandeliers, but her eyes were fixed on the floor. She held a small clutch, her fingers tight around it, as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Her father, Richard Carter, had just walked away after introducing her to a group of suited men, his voice dripping with disappointment. She heard the whispers start before he was even out of earshot. Business tycoons and their wives, their polished shoes clicking on the marble, muttering about her dress, her posture, her everything. One woman, her lips painted red, leaned close to her husband and said loud enough for Sophia to hear, "She looks like she shops at thrift stores." Honestly, Richard's daughter. Sophia's jaw tightened, but she didn't look up. She just adjusted her grip on the clutch, her knuckles whitening. The evening had started with a sting. Earlier in the car, Richard had barely glanced at her. He'd been on the phone barking orders about some merger when he suddenly turned and said, "You're embarrassing me tonight, Sophia. That dress. You couldn't have tried harder." She'd opened her mouth to respond, but he cut her off, his voice sharp. Just don't make a fool of us." The words hit like a slap, and she'd stared out the window, watching the city lights blur past. Her mother used to tell her years ago to keep her chin up, to never let them see you flinch. So she didn't. She sat there silent, her hands folded in her lap, the same way she stood now alone, in a room full of people who thought they knew her worth. "Hey, before we go further, can you do something for me? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to share these stories with you, to walk through these moments together." All right, let's keep going. The ballroom was a sea of wealth men in tailored tuxedos, women in gowns that sparkled like they were stitched with diamonds. Sophia stood by a tall window, the city skyline stretching out behind her, her reflection faint against the glass. A man approached his tie screaming money, his smile fake nice. He was a hedge fund guy, the kind who always had a glass of scotch in hand and a story about his latest deal. "You're Richard's daughter, right?" he said, looking her up and down. "Didn't expect you to look so ordinary." The word landed like a dart. A woman nearby, her earrings dangling like chandeliers, laughed into her wine glass. "I mean, really," she added, "you'd think the Carters would teach their kid how to dress for a gala." Sophia's lips parted, but she closed them, her fingers brushing the edge of her clutch. "I'm here for the event," she said softly, her voice steady. The hedge fund guy smirked. "Sure you are, sweetheart." A server passed by balancing a tray of champagne flutes, and Sophia reached for one, her hand steady despite the eyes on her. The woman with the chandelier earrings snorted loud enough to turn heads. "Careful, dear," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Those glasses aren't cheap. Don't drop it." The hedge fund guy chuckled, leaning closer. "Yeah, maybe stick to water. Wouldn't want you to ruin the carpet." Sophia's fingers paused on the flute, her eyes flicking to the woman's face. She set the glass down, untouched, her movements slow and deliberate. "I'll manage," she said, her voice soft but cutting. The woman's smile faltered, and the server, a young man with tired eyes, gave Sophia a quick, grateful nod before moving on. The crowd's laughter lingered, but Sophia's calm silence seemed to pull the air tighter, making a few guests shift in their seats. Another guest joined in, a politician with slicked back hair and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He was the kind who shook hands too hard, desperate to be remembered. "What do you even do, Sophia?" he asked, his tone mocking. "You don't look like you belong in a boardroom. Maybe you're a secretary somewhere." The group around him chuckled, their laughter sharp slicing through the hum of the crowd. Sophia's eyes flicked up, meeting his for a brief second. "I don't work for anyone," she said, her voice calm but firm. The politician blinked, thrown off, but before he could recover, another voice cut in. A young woman, her dress tight and her heels clicking, leaned forward. "Honey, you should at least wear mascara. You look like you just rolled out of bed." The group erupted again, louder this time, and Sophia's fingers twitched on her clutch. She didn't answer. She just turned slightly, her shoulder angling away, dismissing them without a word. Ethan Hayes stood a few feet away watching the whole thing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, but unassuming in a rented black suit that didn't quite fit. His dark hair was neat, his face clean-shaven, but there was something about the way he stood still alert, like he could move in any direction at a moment's notice. Richard had introduced him earlier, his voice dripping with scorn. "This is Sophia's boyfriend," he'd said, pausing to let the word hang. "Some guy she found. Ethan, right?" The crowd had tittered their eyes, raking over Ethan's ill-fitting suit, his plain shoes. One man, a real estate mogul with a watch that cost more than a car, muttered, "Probably lives in her guest house." Ethan had just smiled a small tight curve of his lips and said nothing. Now, as the insults rained on Sophia, he stayed quiet, his hands in his pockets, his gaze steady on her. A woman in a sequined gown, her hair piled high, sidled up to Sophia. She was the kind of person who thrived on gossip, her smile sharp as a blade. "Sweetie, you don't belong here, right?" she said, her voice syrupy. "This is for people who matter. You're just... What decoration?" Sophia's hand stilled on her clutch. She looked at the woman, her eyes clear, unflinching. "I was invited," she said simply. The woman laughed a high, brittle sound and turned to the crowd. "Invited. Oh, honey, your dad probably felt sorry for you." The words cut deep and Sophia's breath caught for a moment, her fingers tightening again. She didn't respond. She just shifted her weight, her posture straight, her chin lifting just enough to say she wasn't breaking. The music dipped for a moment, and a man in a pinstriped suit, a corporate lawyer with a voice that carried, stepped closer to Sophia. He was the type who loved to hear himself talk, his cufflinks flashing as he gestured. "Look, Sophia, you're a nice girl, but you're out of your league here," he said, his tone patronizing. "Stick to charity luncheons or something. This is a serious event." The crowd around him nodded their murmurs, growing louder, more confident. Sophia's eyes flicked to a small bracelet on her wrist, a simple silver band, a gift from her mother. She touched it briefly, her fingers steady, then looked at the lawyer. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice low but unwavering. The lawyer's mouth opened, then closed, his confidence shaken by her calm defiance. A few guests exchanged glances, the room's energy shifting slightly like a crack forming in glass. Years ago, Sophia used to sit at her mother's vanity, watching her brush her hair. Her mother, elegant but kind, would hum softly, her hands steady. "They'll always try to make you small," Soph, she'd said, once her voice low. "Don't let them... You don't need their approval to stand tall." The memory flickered as Sophia stood there, now the crowd's laughter echoing. She glanced at a small photo in her clutch, a faded picture of her mother smiling in a garden. Her fingers brushed it, then let it go. She didn't need to look longer. She knew who she was. The gala moved on the music-swelling waiters, weaving through with trays of champagne. Richard Carter took the stage, his presence commanding his suit pristine. He was a man who owned every room he walked in, to his voice booming over the microphone. "Tonight, we celebrate Carter Industries' legacy." He began, his eyes scanning the crowd. Then he paused, his gaze landing on Sophia. "And my daughter," he said, his tone shifting, "who could marry a prince but chose a pauper." The room laughed a cruel collective sound. Sophia's face flushed, her lips pressing together. Ethan stood beside her, his expression unchanged, but his hand brushed hers, a quiet anchor. Richard went on. "This is Sophia's boyfriend, Ethan, a guy in a cheap rental suit, probably living off her credit card." The laughter grew louder, sharper, and Sophia's fingers curled into fists. A woman in a red gown, her nails manicured to perfection, leaned toward Sophia. She was a socialite, the kind who lived for these events, her smile all teeth. "Is he really your boyfriend?" she asked, her voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "What does he even do? Work at a gas station?" The table erupted and Sophia's eyes flicked to Ethan. He didn't flinch, just tilted his head slightly, in his smile faint. "I get by," he said, his voice low even. The socialite laughed harder, turning to her friends. "Oh, he gets by. How sweet." Sophia's hand trembled slightly, but she lifted her chin, her voice cutting through the noise. "He's enough for me." The table went quiet for a moment, the socialite blinking caught off guard. As the crowd's laughter faded, a man in a velvet blazer, a tech CEO with a constant smirk, stepped up, swirling his drink. He was the kind who thrived on attention, always ready with a quip to keep the room on his side. "Sophia, come on," he said, his voice loud, performative. "You're a Carter. You're supposed to shine, not fade into the background with him." He jerked his thumb toward Ethan, his smirk widening. The crowd chuckled, feeding off his energy. Sophia's fingers tightened on her clutch, but her eyes stayed steady. She stepped closer to Ethan, her shoulder brushing his. "I shine just fine," she said, her voice quiet but sharp like a blade slipping through silk. The CEO's smirk froze, and a few guests shifted their laughter, dying as her words hung in the air. The insults kept coming, each one sharper than the last. A man with a slick ponytail, a tech entrepreneur who loved the sound of his own voice, leaned forward. "Sophia, you're a Carter. Why settle for that?" He gestured at Ethan, his lip curling. "You're embarrassing your family." Sophia's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. She just adjusted her clutch, her movements deliberate, precise. Another guest, a woman with diamond studs and a fake laugh, chimed in. "Honestly, it's sad. You could have anyone, and you pick a nobody." The word landed like a stone, and Sophia's breath hitched. She looked at the woman, her voice soft but clear. "I pick who I love." The room didn't stop, but a few heads turned, the weight of her words lingering. Ethan stayed quiet, but something shifted in the air around him. A guest, a loudmouth banker with a too-tight tie, raised his glass toward Ethan, grinning. "To the guy who thinks he's good enough for a Carter." The liquid sloshed, and with a flick of his wrist, the banker sent a splash of wine toward Ethan. The crowd gasped, expecting a mess, but Ethan moved just a slight step to the side, his body fluid, precise. Not a drop touched him. The banker's grin faltered, and a few guests clapped, thinking it was a trick. "Nice dodge," the banker muttered, trying to recover. Sophia's eyes flicked to Ethan, catching the way his hands stayed relaxed, his stance unshaken. She'd seen him move like that once before, years ago, when they'd walked through a crowded market and a cart nearly hit her. He'd pulled her back smooth and fast like it was nothing. A woman in a gold dress, her voice loud, and her perfume overwhelming, leaned toward Sophia, her eyes gleaming with malice. She was a fashion influencer, the kind who built her brand on tearing others down. "That dress," she said, her voice carrying across the nearby tables. "Did you borrow it from your maid?" The crowd roared, their laughter sharp and cruel. Sophia's fingers stilled her clutch, slipping slightly in her hand. She looked at the woman, her eyes steady, and tilted her head slightly. "It's mine," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. The influencer's laugh caught in her throat, and she turned away, her cheeks flushing as the crowd's attention shifted, a few whispers, questioning her boldness. Richard's voice boomed again, pulling the room's attention back to the stage. "My daughter could have the world," he set, his eyes hard on Sophia, "but she's throwing it away on him." He pointed at Ethan, his gesture sharp, accusing. The crowd murmured their whispers like a rising tide. A woman in a black dress, her voice dripping with pity, leaned toward Sophia. "You could do so much better, darling. Why drag yourself down?" Sophia's fingers stilled on her clutch, her eyes locking onto the woman's. "I'm not dragged anywhere," she said, her voice low but steady. The woman blinked, her smile faltering, and the crowd's laughter died down for a moment, the air heavy with tension. The night wore on, the insults piling up like weights. A man in a velvet jacket, a venture capitalist with a smirk that never faded, leaned close to Sophia. "You're out of place here," he said, his tone casual but cruel. "This is for people who run things, not whatever you are." Sophia's lips parted, but she stopped, her breath catching. She turned slightly, her eyes catching Ethan's. He gave her a small nod, barely noticeable, but it steadied her. She looked back at the man, her voice calm. "I know exactly where I belong." The venture capitalist laughed, but it was forced, and a few guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing something they couldn't name. A memory flickered. Sophia, maybe 10 years old, sitting in her father's office, her legs swinging off a leather chair. Richard had been on a call, his voice sharp, commanding. She had drawn on a notepad a sketch of a tree, her mother's favorite. When he hung up, he'd looked at her drawing and said, "That's not how you make a mark, Sophia. Power makes a mark." She'd crumpled the paper, her small hands shaking, and promised herself she'd never need his kind of power. Now, standing in this ballroom, she felt that same shake in her hands, but she didn't crumple. She stood taller, her shoulders square, her eyes clear. As the crowd's attention drifted, a man in a tailored coat, a media mogul with a voice that boomed, approached Sophia. He was the kind who loved to dominate conversations, his presence loud and unyielding. "You know, Sophia," he said, his tone condescending, "you're wasting your name on this guy." He gestured at Ethan, his lip curling. "He's dragging the Carter legacy through the mud." The crowd around him nodded, their murmurs growing bolder. Sophia's hand brushed her bracelet again, her fingers lingering on the silver. She looked at the mogul, her voice even. "The Carter name doesn't need saving," she said, her words sharp enough to make him pause. The room's energy shifted, a few guests exchanging glances, the mogul's confidence faltering as Sophia's quiet strength filled the space. The room's energy shifted when a guest, a stocky man with a loud laugh, put a hand on Sophia's shoulder. He was a real estate developer, the kind who bragged about his beach houses at every chance. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, his voice slurring slightly. "You need a real man, not this guy." He gestured at Ethan, his hand heavy on her shoulder. Before Sophia could respond, Ethan stepped forward, his movement smooth, almost casual. He placed a hand on the man's wrist, guiding it off Sophia's shoulder with a gentle but firm pull. The developer froze, his face paling, his hand trembling as he stepped back. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice shaky. The crowd whispered, heads turning. "Did you see that?" someone said. He didn't even flinch. Sophia's eyes flicked to Ethan, her breath catching. She'd felt his strength before in small moments, carrying her groceries up 3 flights of stairs, opening a jar she couldn't budge. But this was different. His grip had been precise, controlled like he could have done more, but chose not to. The whispers grew louder, the crowd's confidence wavering. A woman in a green dress, her voice sharp, muttered, "Who does he think he is?" But her tone wasn't as certain as before. Sophia's fingers brushed Ethan's, a quiet thank you, and he squeezed her hand back, his eyes still on the room. A young man in a flashy suit, a startup founder with a reputation for arrogance, pushed through the crowd, his phone already out recording. "This is gold," he said, his voice loud, mocking. "The Carter girl and her nobody boyfriend. This'll get views." He aimed the phone at Sophia, his grin wide. The crowd laughed, egging him on their phones, starting to appear too. Sophia's face flushed, but she didn't move. She looked at the man, her eyes steady, and said, "Put it away." Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the room pause. The startup founder hesitated, his grin faltering, then lowered his phone, muttering something under his breath. The crowd's laughter died, a few phones slipping back into pockets, the moment shifting as Sophia's presence held the room. Richard's patience snapped. He strode across the ballroom, his face red, his steps heavy. He grabbed Sophia's wrist, his grip tight enough to make her wince. "You're done here," he said, his voice low, but carrying across the silent room. "Break up with him. Now?" Sophia pulled back, her voice breaking for the first time. "Dad, please!" He yanked harder, and she cried out, a small, sharp sound that cut through the crowd. The room went still, every eye on them. A man in a gray suit, a lawyer with a smug grin, called out, "She's better off without him, Richard. Cut her loose." Another guest, a woman with a pearl necklace, nodded. "He's a nobody. She'll thank you later." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes locked on Richard's hand. "Let her go," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound. "You don't tell me what to do, boy." He tightened his grip, and Sophia's face twisted in pain. In one fluid motion, Ethan's hand closed around Richard's wrist. It wasn't a grab, it was a clamp, steady and unbreakable. Richard's knees buckled, his face paling as he tried to pull free and couldn't. The crowd gasped, chairs scraping as people leaned forward. "What the hell?" Richard sputtered, his voice shaking. Ethan leaned in, his voice low. "I'm the one man who will never let go of her." The room was frozen, the air thick with shock. A woman in a blue gown, her voice trembling, shouted, "That's assault! Call security." The lawyer in the gray suit stood, his face red. He should be arrested. Richard, still caught in Ethan's grip, roared, "I'll ruin you. You hear me? Your career is over." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, her hand reaching for Ethan's arm. The crowd's voices rose, a chorus of scorn. "She's throwing her life away." One woman yelled, "A Carter with a thug." Another added. Sophia's shoulders shook, but she didn't look away from Ethan, her hand tight on his. A woman in a silk shawl, a philanthropist with a reputation for cutting remarks, stood up, her voice carrying across the room. "This is a disgrace," she said, her eyes locked on Sophia. "You're spitting on your family's name for this. Nobody." She gestured at Ethan, her shawl slipping slightly as she pointed. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices rising again. Sophia's hand trembled in Ethan's, but she stepped forward, her voice clear. "My family's name doesn't define me," she said, her words sharp enough to make the woman flinch. The philanthropist sat down, her face red as a few guests looked away, the room's confidence cracking further. Ethan released Richard's wrist, letting him stumble back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn military ID, tossing it onto the nearest table. The crowd leaned in curious as a man picked it up, his eyes widening. Ethan Hayes, he read aloud, his voice faltering. Navy SEAL. Former team leader, 12 international operations. The room erupted in whispers, heads turning. A retired general, his chest heavy with medals, stood slowly, his face serious. He raised a hand in a crisp salute. "Commander," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. The crowd's laughter died, replaced by stunned silence. Sophia's hand tightened on Ethan's, her tears spilling over, but her chin-lifted pride flashing in her eyes. Richard staggered back, his face ashen. "A SEAL," he muttered, his voice barely audible. He shook his head, his hands trembling. "So, what? You're still nothing? No money, no status. You can't protect her." A few guests nodded, clinging to their disdain. The woman in the red gown crossed her arms. "Medals don't pay bills," she said, her voice sharp. Sophia stepped forward, her voice breaking, but clear. "Dad, you don't get it. He's more than enough." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, the crowd's murmurs faltered. Some faces softening, others looking away. As the room grappled with the revelation, a man in a double-breasted suit, a private equity tycoon with a penchant for control, stood up, his voice booming. "This changes nothing," he said, pointing at Ethan. "A soldier's tricks don't make him one of us." He turned to Sophia, his eyes cold. "You're throwing away your future for a stunt." The crowd nodded, their confidence rallying. Sophia's eyes flicked to a small ring on her finger, a plain band Ethan had given her months ago. She twisted it slightly, her voice steady. "My future's mine to choose," she said, her words quiet but unyielding. The tycoon's face reddened, and he sat down, the room's energy shifting as Sophia's resolve held firm. Ethan's hand went to his phone, his movements deliberate. He tapped the screen, and a video flickered to life on the ballroom's big screen. The grainy footage showed a desert gunfire popping in the distance. A younger Ethan, his face streaked with dirt, dragged a wounded man to safety, bullets kicking up dust around them. The wounded man's face came into focus. Richard Carter, younger, bloodied, but alive. The crowd gasped, whispers exploding. "That's him," someone said. "He saved Carter's life." Richard's knees gave out, and he sank to the floor, his hands covering his face. "It was you," he whispered, his voice broken. Ethan looked down at him, his voice steady. "You want to protect your daughter with money. I protected your life with blood." Sophia stepped forward, her hands still in Ethan's. She looked at her father, her eyes wet but unflinching. "You can reject me, Dad," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I won't reject the man who proved his worth." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. The hedge fund guy shifted in his seat, his scotch untouched. The socialite in the red gown looked down her nails, digging into her palms. The politician with the slicked-back hair cleared his throat, his grin gone. Sophia turned, her hands still in Ethan's, and they walked toward the exit, the crowd parting without a word. The fallout came fast. The hedge fund guy, the one who'd called Sophia ordinary, got a call. The next day, his firm's biggest investor, a Carter Industries subsidiary, pulled their funding. He was out of a job by the end of the week. The socialite in the red gown woke up to her name trending online, a video of her cruel words at the gala going viral. Her charity board asked her to step down, her invitations drying up. The politician, the one who'd mocked Sophia's place in the room, lost his campaign's biggest donor, a friend of the Carters who'd been in the crowd that night. The fashion influencer who'd sneered at Sophia's dress saw her sponsorships vanish when a major brand tied to the Carters cut her contract. The private equity tycoon found his latest deal stalled his partners, citing reputational concerns after the gala. None of it was loud or dramatic. It was just the truth catching up, the scales tipping back. Sophia and Ethan kept walking, their steps steady, their hands linked. She didn't look back, didn't gloat. Her silence said everything. Her strength, her choice, her love. The city lights stretched out before them, the night air cool against their skin. They'd faced the worst and come out whole. The world had tried to break them, but it couldn't. Not when they stood together. Not when they knew who they were. You felt that too, haven't you? That moment when you're judged, dismissed, but you keep going. You weren't wrong to hold on. You weren't alone. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.